In any case, brothers and sisters, I wanted to make these few remarks on this matter, and I wanted to say a few things to you personally. This is the last chance that I'll get to speak to all of you at once. We in America, whether Canadians or Americans, have the notion that the British people, particularly the English people, are very staid and rather formal. I want to say to you that I have been impressed by your warmth and your love.
Amen. I'll say that too.
I also want to say to you that you're a beautiful lot. You're a beautiful lot spiritually. I can't tell you, too, how nice looking you are. I'm impressed by that. And I mean that whether your origin is Anglo-Saxon or whether it's from some other part of the world. One of the things that impresses me and impressed my wife, I know, is your fine complexions that come from all of this drizzly weather that you have. You see, the rest of us get dried out in parts of the world. And it is really quite nice to be with you, quite refreshing, quite beautiful. And while your physical appearance is good, your spiritual appearance is even better. And I want to tell you how much I love you, how much you mean to me, how wonderful it has been here to be with you, to associate with you, to get to know you. It's a real privilege. And I would ask you something, and that is, when we go back to Canada, and from Canada to the States, and from the States to Mexico, I would like to take your love and your best wishes to all the dear friends over there. Now I want to turn to the subject at hand. Jehovah's Witnesses and the Third Reich. I became interested in this subject when I was working on my book, Apocalypse Delayed, the Story of Jehovah's Witnesses. I got rummaging through the yearbooks, and I came to the 1934 yearbook of Jehovah's Witnesses. And for some reason, I started reading the account relating to Germany. I found in that account what was known as the Declaration of Facts in English, in German the Erklärung. And when I read this document, I could hardly believe my eyes. Why? Because I had read about this document in the book Jehovah's Witnesses in the Divine Purpose, or am I quoting that right?
Yeah.
Yes, Jehovah's Witnesses in the Divine Purpose, 1959. And it had said in there that in June of 1933, shortly after Hitler had come to power, that the witnesses in Germany had met in a convention in Berlin, actually on the 25th of the month, and they had issued a declaration criticizing Hitler for his persecution and stating to him that they would take a stand for Jehovah God and Christ's kingdom. But when I read the 1934 yearbook, I was absolutely astounded, because this document said things that were far different from what Jehovah's Witnesses in the Divine Purpose had said. What did this document say? Well, it was a document which bitterly attacked the British Empire and the United States of America, which bitterly attacked the League of Nations, which bitterly attacked the clergy of Christendom, and which said disreputable things about the Jews. Now remember that the Watchtower Society had taught that the return of the Jews to Palestine was fulfillment of Jehovah's purposes. As a matter of fact, Charles Taze Russell refused to attempt to convert Jews to Christianity. And in 1911, he gave an address to a large Jewish audience in the Hippodrome in New York. And he told them that they were going to be restored to Palestine. He told them that they were part of Jehovah's divine plan. And he ended up his remarks by having the audience stand with him and sing the Zionist national anthem, Hatikvah. Rutherford had followed on that tradition and had written a number of books supporting the idea that the return of the Jews to Palestine was a fulfillment of prophecy. He wrote a book called Comfort for the Jews. He wrote a book called Life. And he talked about the return of the Jews to Palestine. He talked about the Balfour Declaration, which was a declaration of the British government which called for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And he indicated that he felt that all of this was part of the divine plan. Yet suddenly, in 1932, he made a 180-degree turn. New light, without any real explanation for new light. Why was there new light? Because anti-Semitism was raging all over the Western world. In the United States and Canada, the Ku Klux Klan had risen. There was a strong feeling of anti-Catholicism. There was a strong feeling of anti-Semitism, both among Protestants and Catholics, in both the United States and Canada. In Germany, the Nazis were rising, had risen dramatically as a result of the Depression, which had begun in 1929. And suddenly, the Jews had no part in the divine plan. Now it becomes evident that Rutherford really didn't like Jews. My father was at a Bible student convention in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in the early 1920s. And he often repeated this story to me. He heard Rutherford say that God's blessings were going to be on the Palestine Jews. He said, as a matter of fact, I'm talking about the Palestine Jew. I'm not talking about that hook-nosed, stoop-shouldered little individual who stands on the street corner and attempts to gyp you out of every nickel, every 5-cent piece that you've got. And in verification of this attitude, there is a statement which is virtually identical, without the reference to the hook nose, in the Golden Age magazine in the late 1920s. It's all there. Rutherford didn't like Jews. He really didn't like blacks. He didn't like most people. And the fact of the matter was that it was very easy for him to condemn the Jews because the Jews, as he said, were part and parcel of the money-making machine of the world, the commercial entities, which were one of the 3 organizations which were going to be torn down at the Battle of Armageddon. Of course, the other 2 entities were the political and the religious. And the Jews were fully condemned. Now, in the Declaration, Rutherford went so far as to repeat what he said was a proverb in New York. He said, there is a proverb in New York which says, the Irish Catholics run it, the Jews own it, and the Americans pay the bills. Now, the Watchtower literature began to shift its position on the Declaration. How so? Well, in 1985, I published Jehovah's Witnesses, Apocalypse Delayed, the story of Jehovah's Witnesses. And I brought this to the attention, I think for the first time, I brought this to the attention of the English-speaking world, that this is actually what had gone on. And that this document was simply an attempt of the witnesses, and particularly the Watchtower Society, to ingratiate itself with the Nazis. And the most damning statement found in that doctrine, or document rather, pardon me, is the following, and I quote directly. Instead of being against the principles advanced by the government of Germany, we stand squarely for such principles and point out that Jehovah God through Christ Jesus will bring about the full realization of these principles and will give the people grace and prosperity and the greatest desire of every honest heart. The principles of whom? The principles of der Führer, Adolf Hitler. Gott im Himmel. Was für ein Mann. How can this organization, which claims to be neutral, have been guilty of making a statement such as this? What was the Watchtower Society's answer? There was something wrong. Evidently, the branch overseer, who in 1935 was disfellowshipped by Rutherford, was responsible for doctoring the Declaration. And this is what the 1974 yearbook said. The blame was purely on the former branch overseer, a man by the name of Paul Baltzereit. Now, did Baltzereit doctrine the document? The answer is absolutely no. How do we know? Well, all one has to do is sit down and read the English and then read the German, and it becomes obvious that the German is a translation of the English rather than the English a translation of the German. And what German would have written a proverb about the city of New York? This was a fraud, and the Awake Journal has recently admitted that, yes, Rutherford did write this. But they've come up with a new angle. What's the new angle? Well, he really didn't know what Hitler was all about. Now, this is in June of 1933. Hitler came to power on January the 30th, 1933, and the dictatorship was well on its way. The Declaration was distributed all over Germany, and along with the Declaration, a private letter was sent to Adolf Hitler. This was evidently written by Baltzereit rather than Rutherford, but with Rutherford's full authorization, because Rutherford was in Berlin along with Nathan Knorr immediately prior to the June 25th convention. And in this, Baltzereit said, oh, Rutherford has always been friendly towards Germany. As a matter of fact, he was sent to jail in the First World War for refusing to attack Germany in 2 publications of which he was the editor. Now this is as phony as a $3 bill, because the Bible students in the First World War attacked Germany along with everybody else, and when Rutherford and his colleagues were facing prison in the spring of 1918, they said it was all right to buy war bonds, and they called on the Bible student community to pray for an Allied victory over Germany. But this was what Balsarite tried to pan off on the Nazis. Besides this, he said that Rutherford refused to publish the atrocity propaganda about Germany. Now, what did he mean here? Now, this is very interesting. The Jewish press outside of Germany was horrified by the Nazis' attacks on the Jews. And in France, in England, and in America, the press began to publish accounts of the attacks on Jews in Germany. And in this letter to Hitler, they say, oh, we had nothing to do with that. In fact, the very people who put out the atrocity propaganda against Germany are our worst enemies. Who? The Catholics and the Jews, the commercial Jews of America. Now the fact is that there was a good deal of Catholic persecution of the witnesses, but there is no evidence at all whatsoever of the Jews being involved in the persecution of the witnesses. It was nothing but a thoroughgoing lie. Now then, what happened? Well, this is very interesting. The fact is that the day before the convention, the German government, actually both the German and Prussian governments, placed an absolute ban on the witnesses in Germany, and on the 28th of June, they seized the branch offices of the Watchtower Society in Magdeburg. Now, fascinatingly, while the Nazis were doing this, the witnesses were distributing the Declaration of Facts, although a great many of the ordinary witnesses were not willing to go along with it. The fact is, however, that the witnesses who had been distributing anti-American tracts all over Germany in the form of a booklet called The Crisis, which was a talk that Rutherford had given, one of the talks at least that Rutherford had given, the previous year in Washington, D.C. during what is known as the Bonus Army Affair. When the Depression came, there were thousands of people in America who were in terrible distress, and veterans of the First World War had been promised a bonus of $500, but they were not to receive it until 1945. Now these people went to Washington with their wives and children, and they said, give us this money, we're starving, give it to us right now. We fought for our country, give us the money. Well, the American government, under President Hoover, refused. And the police tried to drive some of these people out of Washington, D.C., and a couple of men were killed. Then the president sent in the American Army under Douglas MacArthur. They killed a couple of men. They gassed 2,000. A baby died, and a small boy was blinded. This was under Generals MacArthur and Dwight David Eisenhower. It was a terrible event in American history. But before this occurred, Rutherford had gone to these people and given a speech in which he said that the United States was soon to be governed by a dictator, and then Jehovah God was going to come in and destroy it. It was staunchly anti-American, if everything ever was. Now Rutherford had a real hatred for the United States and Great Britain. As I've said, the only thing that he liked about Great Britain was that there wasn't prohibition over here. The fact is, though, that after having distributed the crisis, having said all of these things, what did Rutherford do before he went back to the United States, before the 25th of June convention? He went running to the American Consul and called on the assistance of the American State Department, because the Watchtower was an American organization, and there was a 1923 treaty between Germany and the United States which said that Germany couldn't seize the property of American companies. And believe it or not, the American Consul and the American State Department, after having been attacked in the most vicious way by this man and by the witnesses, went to bat for them and fought all summer long in 1933 to have the Watchtower properties restored and to have the witnesses granted religious freedom in Germany. Now, one can say that the American government, along with every government in the world, has done some very wrong and occasionally some very corrupt things. But there is a beautiful side to American history and to American attitudes. And one of them is that there is a large segment of Americans who believe thoroughly in the principles of freedom. And the result was that the American government went to bat. Well, what happened then was very interesting. Rutherford sent the Central European branch overseer to Germany to try and work with the American embassy, the American consular officials, to get the property back, to get the presses rolling again. In the meantime, the Germans burned practically all Watchtower literature. But as a result of the fact that the Germans still needed good relations with the United States in the early 1930s, eventually they turned the property back. They allowed the Bethel workers to go back into the Magdeburg plant. They allowed them to stay there till 1935, and they even allowed them to print Bibles. The witnesses were to a certain extent suffering. Some of them lost their jobs because they wouldn't heil Hitler. Some of them were actually persecuted, picked up, and sent to jail for short periods of time, but things were not too serious in the early 1930s in Germany for them. Rutherford, at first, wanted them to keep their heads down. And he had his representative in Central Europe, in Germany, a man by the name of Harbeck, send out a letter to all of the witnesses in Germany. And this is a most amazing letter. Brothers, obey the law. Do not hold any meetings unless the police permit you to. Do not give any public talks. Do not order literature. Everything is under ban. And then he ended up by saying, and this is very interesting, we may not be able to carry on the witness work until the millennium. So just be quiet. Do what the Nazis want you to do. And this letter was distributed all over Germany, and there's a picture, a damaged copy of this letter, which is on the internet in German. It hasn't been translated except in my documents yet. But that's what it says, and Harbeck also says that he is acting as the direct deputy or representative of Hitler, of Rutherford.
It's the same.
The many shows, and that Rutherford has given him these instructions. Now then, in the early fall of the year, it became obvious that while the Nazis were willing to let them have the property, were willing to let them print Bibles, weren't going to bother them particularly except at local level, they were not going to allow them to distribute Watchtower literature in Germany. So in the November the 1st, 1933, Watchtower, Rutherford published an article called "Fear Them Not," and it came out in German the next month. And it said, you have to go out and preach. And some of you say, well, maybe we'll be killed if we do that. Well, that's all right. That's what you should expect. The result was that the witnesses were ordered to go from door to door, ordered to distribute smuggled literature, and if they got caught, they should expect to be executed. Now here was Rutherford, sitting back in Brooklyn and sunning himself in San Diego, California during the winters. As the former Canadian branch overseer Walter Salter said, going from drink to drink while we go from door to door. It's a horrifying thing. And what did the witnesses in Germany do? The argument that is given by the Watchtower Society and by a number of scholars is that they went out and did what Rutherford told them. The fact of the matter is that after a careful study of this matter, I calculate that no more than 2/5 of them did. And the 1974 yearbook admits that even many of the circuit overseers, people at the branch offices, and many of the ordinary witnesses felt that this was foolish. And they used the Harbeck letter. They said, you know, this Watchtower can't be right because look, we have this letter. What's up here? Well, of course, Rutherford had done another 180-degree turn. Well, some of them did. Things weren't too bad in the early 30s, and other religious organizations were keeping their heads down. Oh, the Nazis hated everybody. Hitler said, oh, I love the churches, and you've got to have religion taught in the schools and so forth. At the same time, he was suppressing certain religious groups, and he was even throwing numerous priests in jail, despite a concordat with the Vatican. And if you want to read a nasty story about somebody else's compromise, read Cornwell's book, Hitler's Pope, about Pope Pius the 12th, Pacelli as he was then, Cardinal Pacelli. It is one of the most revealing things in the world because this man not only sold out the German people as a whole, but he sold out the Catholic laity, the Catholic party, and to a certain extent the Catholic clergy in Germany, who in the beginning were prepared to take a stand against Hitler. Now, it's interesting, we see so much of a parallel here between the behavior of Pacelli on one hand and the behavior of Rutherford on the other. Now, what this resulted in was, of course, that the witnesses irritated the Nazis. And if this wasn't enough, by the fall of the next year, Rutherford called them to meet and distribute a statement attacking the Nazi government all over Germany, and telegrams were sent from America, Britain, all over the rest of the world saying, Hitler, if you don't stop your persecution of the witnesses, God is going to strike you and your National Socialist regime. Well, you know, you don't wave a red flag in front of a bull. You don't incite a crazy man. And this occurred after Hitler had turned on many of his own supporters, the left wing of his party, the SA, and Ernst Röhm, and taken many of these people out and shot them. There was a bloodbath in Germany already. And here Rutherford has them send these telegrams, and you can imagine what happened. Jehovah's Witnesses and the Divine Purpose and numerous other sources give an account by a man who was present when Hitler received these telegrams And he went into an absolute rage and said, I'm going to destroy this brood in Germany. Well, Rutherford, as I say, was back in Beth Sarum, very comfortable. And shortly thereafter, he was to do the same thing with the American and Canadian witnesses over the flag salute issue by saying things which enraged the public and turned the persecution loose on the ordinary Jehovah's Witnesses. The result was, of course, the terrible persecution of the witnesses. Now, the interesting thing is, many of these facts, I brought out some of them in Apocalypse Delayed, but thereafter I wrote another article in the Quest magazine, and I had obtained other information. I obtained statements from a talk given on the history of Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany by Konrad Franke, who had been a former branch overseer after World War II. And Franke tells very frankly about the 1933 convention. And he said that when he and another witness brother arrived there on a motorcycle, the place was decked with swastikas. And they went inside, and they were very upset because they sang a hymn, and the words were all right, but the music was the same music as the Deutschlandlied, or Deutschland über alles. And here, can you imagine these people who were being persecuted, who hated Nazism, who had been taught that the nation was of the devil, had to stand up and sing this song. And then the declaration was presented. And a lot of them said, we're not having anything to do with this. They were horrified at the attempt to compromise with the Nazis. I published the declaration, I published the Hitler letter, I published the material from Franke's talk in both German and English. Interestingly, this very soon got onto the internet. Some of you may have seen some of this there on the internet. The brothers in Italy, ex-witnesses, translated my article into Italian, and it created quite a stir in Italy. A German doctoral student by the name of Detlef Garbe somehow got a hold of a copy of my article, and he used it in his doctoral dissertation, which became a book which has gone through 4 editions. Witnesses, in effect, put the swastikas up. And he goes on beyond that to say that they opened the convention with the German national anthem. I didn't say that. Franke didn't say that. But in the last 2 editions, he has changed this and said it wasn't true at all. He said, it was my misunderstanding. Well, it was his misunderstanding. But the interesting thing is that the Watchtower archivist in Germany, a man by the name of Johannes Brobel, got in touch with him, and it's obvious from footnotes in both of their works, that they have become close friends or associates, and some of the ex-witnesses in Germany claim that Garbe may now be a Jehovah's Witness. Well, it sure sounds like it in the last several editions of his book. The interesting thing is that Vrobel produced an article in a book, the translation of which is Jehovah's Witnesses Were Always the Bravest. It's all in German. Has written an article, and Vrobel comes right out and claims that the statement that the witnesses put up swastikas and that they started the convention with the German national anthem was based on what Garba read in my article. And he says, it's an ominous English publication by Gaitner, opposers. Now the fact is, it's a downright lie. And the interesting thing is that it's pretty obvious that Vrobel was the one who wrote a major article in the Awake in which they deny anything that Konrad Franke said. They show a couple pictures of the hall, and you can't see any flags there. Well, whether there were flags in the main hall or not, who knows? But we have Franke's testimony, and they're denying this all over the place. They're also denying something else that I've said, and that is that they were anti-Semitic, and that Rutherford was trying to scapegoat the Jews. Oh, they've denied this. And Garba has said, oh, the witnesses weren't anti-Semites, because anti-Semitism is connected with racism, and Jehovah's Witnesses respect everybody equally. The fact of the matter, however, that Garba is only one person who has gotten on the Watchtower bandwagon. Over the recent years, the Watchtower has carried on a major campaign on the European continent, I suspect here in Britain, and certainly in North America. They've gone to various universities. They've even set up separate organizations to talk about the witnesses and the Holocaust and how the witnesses were persecuted in Germany. And they've done something that's very interesting. They have taken a leaf out of the book of the Moonies and the Scientologists. Now I know this because I know what these organizations do, because I've had invitations from them many times. And what they do is they get academics in Europe, in Asia, and above all in Britain and North America. They wine them, they dine them, they take them all over the place, and then they use these academics to make statements on behalf of their organization. And the witnesses, going a step further, saw that a movie was produced here, not a movie, but rather a video was produced here in Britain, the Purple Triangles, which talked about a particular German family that was truly persecuted. They thought it was a great idea. So they produced a much larger video called Jehovah's Witnesses Stand Fast Against Persecution. How many of you have seen that? Only a couple of you. Well, it's a very powerful, well-done thing. And it stars quite a number of academics in it defending Jehovah's Witnesses. And one of the key persons who is used over and over again is an English academic by the name of Christine King. I have her book, and in general her book is fairly objective and fairly fair, although in a few places it's rather sloppy. But in general, she recognized the witnesses for what they really were at the time. And she says that the Declaration was a compromising document. She based a lot of her work on the study of a Canadian academic by the name of Michael Cater. I've talked to Cater, and he's horrified over some of the things that he's reading now. And both Cater and King talk about the autocratic nature of the Watchtower Society and Jehovah's Witnesses. But on top of this, what is really interesting is that King suddenly in this video says, oh, Jehovah's Witnesses were all united from the very beginning. They spoke with one voice. They didn't compromise. There's a woman by the name of Milton who is at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. She says all sorts of nice things about Jehovah's Witnesses. There's a friend of mine from the University of British Columbia, an Englishman who has written on the Holocaust. They've used him. Garba appears in this. And then they've produced this book. And there are numerous books out in German and in French in particular. And they're now getting into Spanish. And they're pushing the idea that if anybody attacks or opposes Jehovah's Witnesses, what they're attempting to do is launch a new persecution. Well, I have had enough of this. As they say in French, trop est trop. Enough is enough. And what I am doing right now is working on a major typescript, which I hope to have to a publisher no later than this spring. I already have a couple of publishers who are prepared to look at it. I have spent a lot of time translating the German into English. I've had to have some help because although I studied German in university, that was back in the Pleistocene era. And I've had to renew my knowledge of the language. I've had to use a lot of French documentation and some in Spanish. And of course, the French is easier and the Spanish is easier still. And the easiest, of course, is the English. And I hope to have this manuscript to the press. But I want to say here a few things about this. Others have exposed, particularly in Germany. As early as 1961, the German popular magazine, Der Spiegel, which means the mirror in English, published the facts that the man who had been branch overseer right after the war, Eric Frost, and by the way, Eric Frost is the man who composed the tune, Firm and Determined in this time of the end, prepared our God's servants the good news to defend. Well, Eric Frost claimed that he was like Daniel in the lion's den when the Gestapo arrested him. Didn't give in a bit. And yet, Der Spiegel produced documents and printed them from the Gestapo. Evidently, it was the communist East German regime that produced these documents and sent them to Der Spiegel. There was also a book produced in East Germany which had all sorts of documentation in it, a lot of documents from the Gestapo. And here these documents showed that Frost and a number of others, and other members of Watchtower officials, had actually compromised, given information to the Gestapo about their brothers. Now, in truth, in all fairness, this isn't as serious as it first appears. Because there are now a number of historical studies that show what the Nazis did to the witnesses every time there was a distribution of literature, was they would round up a few of them and beat them till they were nearly dead, torture them, put them under cold water, give them drugs, everything else, until they had no control over themselves and they'd confess. And this is probably what happened to Frost and a number of these others. They actually probably did try to stand up to the Gestapo, but they simply couldn't. And had they admitted that, had they been honest about that and said that's the case, no one could condemn them for it. But the problem is that the Watchtower Society doesn't like to publicize that anybody broke. Frost was upset over this, upset over the Spiegel article, and he said to Noor, he said, "What should I do about this?" Noor said, "Oh, we get letters like that all the time. Just throw them in the wastebasket." You see, the problem here is that this organization refuses to admit that it's made up of ordinary human beings who commit sins like everybody else. They want this pure picture of themselves. And now that's getting them into terrible trouble, because all of these documents are coming to the fore, and they're being publicized, they're being put on the internet. And it's very, very destructive to them. Yet, still in all, they are getting a lot of support. And not just from Jehovah's Witnesses. I've mentioned some of the scholars. There's another woman who has written a book called Jehovah's Witnesses Under Two Dictators in Germany, Gabriela Jona. And here I just want to say a few words in closing, in caution. In real caution to all of you and anyone who has a ministry to Jehovah's Witnesses. Be extremely careful. There is a real backlash going on in the academic world and in other places against anti-cult ministries. Why? Well, a great many of these scholars and academics are civil libertarians to the tips of their toes. They know how Jehovah's Witnesses have been persecuted. They know how other religious groups have been persecuted. Many of them are horrified at what the French government is doing, and to a lesser extent the German government, both to the Witnesses and the Church of Scientology. And it goes beyond scholars. It includes a fairly sizable number of clergy of the major churches. Why? They are saying, and they're right, that there is a very, very strong anti-religious movement abroad throughout the Western world. Particularly in continental Europe, but it's in the United States and North America as well. And they say, if too many precedents are set for the legal suppression of what are called the sects or the cults, maybe the churches are next. We therefore really need to be super careful in dealing with questions involving Jehovah's Witnesses. We can expose their weaknesses, their foibles, their lies, everything else. We can extend ministries to them in love. But before God, do not attempt to bring the secular authorities any more than is necessary. On the types of cases that Dwayne has talked about, blood transfusion cases, child custody cases, that's a different matter because we're dealing with individual situations. But to attempt to encourage the secular state to suppress or do anything about these religious organizations is incredibly dangerous. And it will bring a major backlash from civil libertarians, from scholars, and from the churches itself. So be forewarned. And this is why, in the work that I'm doing, anything and everything that I'm attempting to do must be proven, footnoted, and fair. And one of the things that I will do is this. I will say this, that of all of the people who stood up to Hitler in the period of the Third Reich, ordinary Jehovah's Witnesses, not the leaders of the Watchtower Society, but ordinary Jehovah's Witnesses were the most brave of all.